Welcome back to Nailing It Down. And today we're going to talk about something crucial to this entire project and crucial to the rise of socialist media and the general approach to advocacy and politics taken by many leftists since the 1960s, and that is awareness raising. Now, one thing people don't think about awareness raising is that it's a form of education, right? And there are limits to education. Now, I will talk all the time about the limits of education. People forget this, but this is my day job. All right. I study effective pedagogy. I study how to teach people. I've taught teachers, and I'm still a teacher to this day. There are a lot of myths that are even perpetuated by education programs about how education works, and this is doubly true in advocacy and activism. Now, I was talking to my friend J.G. Michael yesterday, actually, about why I no longer teach media literacy and critical thinking classes. I have, when I had curricular control, which right now I work at a public school and I didn't, taught such classes, and they lined up with the general research that indicates that they don't work in abstract, meaning that teaching media literacy, qua media literacy, doesn't really make kids media literate and may even have adverse effects or maladaptive effects due to the fact that teaching people to be critical is often employed selectively. Now, that's not true if you teach media literacy in the context of specific goals, in the context of specific kinds of knowledge, right? Then media literacy becomes effective, but isolated and on its own, it's actually something that people weaponize to discredit information they don't want to believe. Similar with critical thinking. We've had 30 to 40 years of critical thinking courses consistently. Study after study finds, and this is backed up by both Hattie's effect size metadata research in 2018 and in 2021, that critical thinking courses have little to no effect on critical thinking. All right. Because critical thinking is actually domain specific. How you critically think in a context really matters. So what does work? Well, what does work is a mixture of things. So if you look at the effect sizes, you can see the most gains from teacher efficacy and knowledge. All right, you have an effect size and a half from that, which means our 1.7 effect size, which means you get a year and a half additional gains if teacher knowledge is high. Self-reported and reflective grading, meaning that students grade themselves along with teachers, setting goals for themselves. Teacher estimating where students are at. And cognitive task analysis, having kids think about what they're doing in a specific detail. And these also hold for adults. And the another big factor, I'm skipping a couple because they're not really relevant to us here, is teacher credibility and deliberate transfer strategies. But teacher credibility is generally how much does the student like the teacher and trust them. Not that they have a friend relationship, but there's a trust relationship established. Okay, now you're like, Varn, but I'm an activist. I didn't come to hear you teach me how to teach. But most of what people do in a lot of left spheres right now is education related, including not just the media, including organizing. All right. So, what's important? What is important is that you train people to be competent in skills, you give them good facts, you train people to think about how they are doing things and relate it to a larger theory of operations. For me, that is Marxism, that is, specifically historical materialism, modified by social anthropology, modified again by complexity theory, and modified again by systems and cybernetic theory. right? You will hear one thing that I constantly get in fights with people about, and they don't understand this. I do not care about appeals to popularity. That does not build a new social movement. That reinforces the status quo. And that is also true, by the way, in education. Appeals to educational fads usually have low educational efficacy. And the same is true with consciousness raising. Furthermore, credibility is established in a social context and is reinforced when all members of a team or all members of a learning unit, etc., feel like they are immersed, cared for, and in the same side. Because that allows for the reduction of cognitive dissonance pain, meaning that being wrong is rewarded instead of being seen as a point of failure. This is crucial, and it is a fundamental mistake of the way a lot of people engage in even the way they talk about people. When you go online and you're doing this or that as a leftist and you're just trying to get sick burns, yes, some of that has some performative value to the people watching you, but it's a very inefficient way to educate anyone about anything. It feels good, gives you a good dopamine hit, but it's not particularly useful for consciousness raising. Now, here's what I'm going to tell you. Consciousness raising outside of its social context and specific goal is useless. All right. Just giving people facts are giving people interpretive frameworks, which is actually often what leftists confuse for facts, unfortunately, does not really do anything. And in fact, if you are, say, a leftist media person and you're just going out there and debunking and getting the sick burns or doing thought defense against this, that, or the other, this right-wing thought or this left-wing thought, and you don't put it in a social context which people can use, they will not learn it. Now, there's class differences in the way this manifests, all right? Usually people who are more secure, have a more secure background, are more willing to take counterintuitive modes. They're less likely to rely purely on the relationship to the person speaking. Thus, they're less likely to make the mistake of, say, ad hominem dismissal of ideas. But a lot of people who try to advocate for just pure truth factors are also being, frankly, misleading. Because one, there's an interpretive framework involved, and two, even in the case of high novelty seeking intellectual pursuits, like it's rewarded in academia, and academia rewards novelty seeking because it rewards unique results. This in and of itself, divorced from our social context, can actually lead to worse and worse results over time. This is known, all right? And overstatement of the actual data in which you have. So when you are going out against anyone's preconceived notions and social convention, you have to establish your credibility. And it's funny because ancient thinkers knew this and early organizers knew this. Social unionizing was taking this idea of unions back in the time, particularly in the 20s and 30s, and putting the union in a social context in which people learn to trust that the people giving this information and fighting for their job benefits and politically organizing were also people who they went out and played sports with, this, that, and the other. This is why social alienation often leads to the persuasiveness of misinformation, not the other way around. All right. Societies that are given to misinformation are usually highly socially alienated with high levels of social distrust between individuals. The misinformation is not what's causing the distrust. The social alienation is. Now, that's a bold statement. It's one that I can't entirely prove, but it's one that, to me, if you look at the educational research that we've seen and also research on advocacy, which indicates that advocacy is usually only effective when there's a clear organization, concrete steps to do, and a clear relationship of accountability between both parties, both the advocate and those being advocated to. That is when advocacy tends to work, or conscious awareness tends to lead to some kind of result. Broad-based theoretical advocacy is not effective. However, you need the broad-based theory to come up with a coherent theory of engagement and interaction to place that social context in and to explain things around. So it's not that theory and all that is useless, it's that it is not in and of itself going to help you with political goals. And I think this explains a lot of the inefficacy of the left today, either in its current political strategy or in its base building strategy, where it is not always building the entire social context, but is more interested in the primitive accumulation of simple cadres. And there's a lot to overcome on that, because the reasons why people are alienated from each other are not just social distrust in and of itself. Remember, the alienation is what's driving the social distrust, not the other way around. And that social distrust actually is usually rooted in real things. All right, and worker competition, and fear of neighborhood destabilization, and fear of being left out, in fear of more brute forms of competition, be that extra legal, criminal, etc., pushing you out. That increases, and it increases even stress hormones, makes it harder to learn, makes learning less effective, makes learning that you teach more likely to be weaponized in a way that confirms prior biases. That's important. And if you don't understand that, you can't really do organizing, you can't really do advocacy, and you probably shouldn't do social media. For all that I complain about the dangers of parasocial relationships, some parasocial relationships are useful for establishing credibility. It is making sure you draw the correct boundaries and the correct lines for credibility to maintain, where that parasocial relationship is one of respect and authority, mutual respect and authority. You also need to respect your audience and hold them accountable, all right, as part of your own way of maintaining credibility. By doing this, you develop an actual two relationship that actually starts to bridge past the parasocial into the limitedly social. And that's the important thing, right? Parasocial relationships are only bad when they are one way and projected upon. So with all that, I was planning on finally getting back to my study of imperialism, but as I dig into the Anti-Imperial League and the histories of imperialism and the theories around it, I discovered that there's always more to read. And now I have like 4 more books and like 50 more articles I feel like I need to go to before I give it to you. It is coming though, and I will be talking about the history of anti-imperialism, specifically in America, because I think it is largely not understood and mischaracterized. And frankly, it is often projected as either a purely left-wing or a purely right-wing phenomenon, depending on who's framing it. And neither of those things are true. So for example, many people think that most post-Confederate leaders were all filibusters, while the CSA did have a filibuster expansionist program. In general, for example, post-Confederate politicians tended to be slightly more sympathetic to anti-imperialism, but were highly racist. Now, we obviously don't tell ourselves this story anymore because it conflicts with narratives we want to tell about the relationship between empire and racial attitudes. And it also made for better fellows historically, because you'd have these weird isolationist movements on one hand, many of whom were very right wing and not truly isolationist, because they weren't always isolationist towards the quote American sphere of influence on the Monroe Doctrine, but were really against expanding empire, even sometimes within the United States and within the continental United States, and definitely in regards to the Philippines and other places that have been commonwealths or imperial holdings of the United States outside of the continent. And that is something you need to study. The progressive movement was often split on these lines, with more progressives being imperialists than not. That's the kind of thing that I'm trying to untangle. And if you're trying to break this down into 15-minute episodes, you really have to be careful. So I hope you give me some patience on coming up with that. Until then, I'm going to be continue doing these pedagogical things and answering questions that come up in my Patreon and the Discord channel for Barn Blog. All right. I'll have one of these in a month. You take care. And remember, develop your individual capacities, but do so in a social context. That is how you nail it down. Over and out.